Thank you, Melanie, and thanks for the very warm welcome here today. I will say, though, I am a little disappointed because last night at the reception, Michael Decker told me that they would play the organ when I came up. I think he was going to play the Scorpions. So today I'm giving a talk titled Technology Assessment as Political Myth. And at the outset, I'll apologize because this is a new talk on a new subject for me. So I don't have it quite down, so I'm going to watch my time. And what I hope to do is to challenge some thinking and hopefully some reaction. If I do my job, then you'll feel provoked and give me some feedback, and I can't think of a better audience really anywhere to present this talk. So what I'm going to talk about, what are we doing when we do what we call technology assessment? I'm not going to get into the debate over what is technology assessment. In the United States, the 1980s, technology assessment was often described as, well, whatever OTA does, that must be technology assessment. This is a little different question, and I'm going to provide an answer. What we do when we do technology assessment is we construct, reinforce, and define political myth. Now, political myth is a jargon term from political science. And I'll explain very precisely what I mean by that. But if you buy that argument that we are in the business of creating and defending political myth, then it implies some very special responsibilities for us as technology assessors. So that's where I'm going. And I'm going to advance this argument through two cases. And I think it's very important to talk about the details of cases in order to understand the argument. The first case is about basic research and innovation, and the second case is the Green Revolution. And I'm going to try to characterize both of these in terms of political myth. So what is political myth? Here's just a few small bits from the relevant literature. Political myth is comprised of the most basic assumptions that justify and explain the possession and use of power, whether or not the assumptions are true. So, as you probably know, the word myth in English, and I assume in other languages, often refers to something that's not true. So that's not the case here. A political myth could be true, or maybe it's not true, but it's a story we tell ourselves. So the term myth is analogous to concepts such as discourse, narrative, or worldview. Faith in myths enables us to mobilize the emotional energies of the personality, to exploit our limited capacity for reason, and to coordinate collective action in a complex, changing world that no one can understand entirely. Political myths are mapping devices through which we look at the world, feel about it, and therefore also act within it as a social group. So political myth is the stories that we tell ourselves, the shared stories that motivate why we act, how we act, in a collective way. Political myths are essential to collective action. I won't go much further, but there is a technical literature, and the elements of political myth are beliefs, actions, and symbols. But rather than the jargon, the way I'd like to think of political myth, this is Morpheus, if you know the Matrix. And Morpheus offers Neo a red pill and a blue pill. And as technology assessors, I would like to make the case that really what we all do is we offer people a choice between the red pill and the blue pill. And if you want to understand political myth, as Morpheus says, do you really want to go down the rabbit hole? Because you're not sure where you may wind up. So right now, we're going to go down the rabbit hole. All right, so the first case. Our political myth, and I call this our political myth, the myth of basic research and innovation. And by us, I mean academics, scientists, experts. And yes, of course, it's true that many of us, people in this room, myself included, have critiqued this political myth, but I'm going to talk a bit about it. And of course, at the center of the myth of innovation and the role of science and technology in society is what's been called the linear model. And it's a pipeline here, and you put money in one end of the pipeline, starting usually with basic research, and through this process of basic applied development, technology application in a nice linear fashion, out of the other end of the pipeline pops out things like iPhones and drugs and economic benefits and health and so on. So I was interested in understanding this linear model, where it came from, why it shapes our theory, how it became a political myth. This is the very first editorial in Science magazine from 1883, and it has a statement of values, which I think is very common in our community. Research is nonetheless genuine, investigation nonetheless worthy, because the truth it discovers is utilizable for the benefit of mankind. Granting even that the discovery of truth for its own sake is a nobler pursuit, it may readily be conceded that the man who discovers nothing himself, but only applies it to useful purposes, the principle which others has discovered, stands on a lower plane than the investigator. Basic research is good, it's up here. The applied researchers, messy, not very good. So there's this cultural aspect that permeates our thinking about research. So in a project I did, I wanted to find out, where does this phrase in English, basic research, which has its equivalents in German and other languages, where does it come from? It didn't always exist. And so I traced it back to where it came from. I won't have time to develop this fully, but I just want to say a few things. The first mention of the phrase basic research in the New York Times, which is really the paper of record in the United States, was 1922. And that was due to a report from the US Department of Agriculture that said research is the basic work of the department. The phrase basic research, when it was first coined, meant applied research. And it was transformed, and I'll talk about that transformation. So if you look over time at the use of this phrase, basic research, this is Science and Nature, as you know, the two leading science journals. You see this increase and then a sharp decline as we've moved to fundamental and transformative and other sorts of research. I would argue that our political myth about basic research has fallen apart a bit. This is in the US Congress. The dark line shows the mentions by members of Congress, the elected officials in the parliament, and the dashed line shows the people who testify before them. So you can see here that the members of Congress got tired of basic research before the scientists and others did. It really became a symbol, a potent political symbol, as many of you, I'm sure, are aware, with the publication of Science, the Endless Frontier by Vannevar Bush, which was a report about the future of US science in the post-World War II era, 1945. Later in his memoirs, Vannevar Bush explained why this term was included. He said, "To persuade the Congress of the pragmatically inclined United States to strong organization to support fundamental research would seem to be one of the minor miracles. When talking matters over with some of these people on Capitol Hill, it was well to avoid the word fundamental and instead use basic." So it was a political motivation to coin a term, basic research, which to the scientists signaled fundamental, curiosity-driven research that scientists love, the higher plane. But to the politician, basic also meant the first step in this pipeline leading to practical benefits. So it was a potent symbol that could mean pure science and applied science at exactly the same time. This coincided with a transition in the United States from science policy and technology policy being controlled by the agricultural experts, very practical sorts of scientists, to the physicists, of which here's Vannevar Bush was one of them. So political myths are used to justify the exercise of power. And in this case, it represented really a revolution in who was in charge of science policy in a US setting. And I would argue that the mythology of basic research is almost universal. I was at a workshop last year in Bonn, and they had people from around the world, from China, from Europe, from Japan, from the United States. And this idea of basic research really is cross-cultural at this point. So this myth lives on. So this is, I got a tweet from Brian Cox, who's a very prominent popularizer of science in the UK. He said, "I think we should simply state that basic research is good as an axiom, and one day you'll work out how to measure impact." Ha ha ha. That's what we do in the social sciences. But this has larger implications too. So in 1957, Robert Solow published his famous paper that talked about the so-called residual effect and trying to explain economic growth. And he called that residual that couldn't be explained by other factors technical change. That Solow residual as technical change has been transformed by our community, by politicians, to technological change and even R&D. So when you see claims that research and development is the key to economic growth and so on, it goes back to this assumption about how science shapes economic growth. But if you take a look at what he actually wrote, he said this: "I'm using the phrase technical change as a shorthand expression for any kind of shift in the production function. Thus slowdowns, speed-ups, improvements in the education of the labor force, and all sorts of things will appear as technical change." So basically everything that we can't explain is technical change, but we have reduced that to technological change, often R&D, as the first element in a linear model. That is the overriding political myth of innovation and some of where it came from. Now I'm going to talk about a second case, the Green Revolution. That's Norman Borlaug on the left. This is Time magazine talking about the population explosion. And I'm going to wade a little bit deeper into this political myth. So the Green Revolution as a political myth. Here's the story, and you can compare this with your own thinking about the Green Revolution. So a massive famine was going to occur in the developing world. Hundreds of millions, maybe billions of people were going to die. So this is the 1950s, 1960s. Science came to the rescue by inventing modern varieties of crop strains, especially wheat. The predicted famine was averted, and since the famine didn't occur, the predictions must have been correct. I'll say more about that. In agriculture today, we need more events like the Green Revolution in Africa to deal with climate change. A topic that's very popular here in Europe is GMOs. Many people say we need GMOs for the second Green Revolution. So the Green Revolution, the original Green Revolution, provides a generalizable model for successful innovation policies. So what I'm going to do, and again, we're going to go down the rabbit hole, the red pill and the blue pill, and talk about what's behind this political myth. Why is it constructed in the way that it is? So already by 1970, the Green Revolution mythology was well established. So this is again from the New York Times. Until recently, the world's food experts were wondering how to drive off the specter of hunger and frustrate the predictions of Malthus, who warned in 1798 that population was outrunning food supply. Today, many experts are concerned about the specter of feast rather than famine, and a single phrase, the Green Revolution, signals the new attitude and growing vogue. This was also reinforced, so this was 6 years ago when Norman Borlaug died. This is his obituary in the New York Times. 1970, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He was widely described as the father of the broad agricultural movement called the Green Revolution. His breeding of high-yielding crop varieties helped to avert mass famines that were widely predicted in the 1960s, altering the course of history. So this is a political myth that's been constructed. So let's go a little deeper. So here's Norman Borlaug accepting his Nobel Prize in 1970. And he gave a speech. His acceptance speech really helped to solidify this as political myth. He said in his speech, "The term Green Revolution has been used by the popular press to describe the spectacular increase in cereal grain production during the past 3 years. Indian wheat production," so there's a key focus on India here, has in an increase from 1964-65 through 1970, and it increased by such a large amount that this was the justification for receiving the Nobel Prize. Now, there's a lot of nuance and details here, but one thing I'll point out is that Borlaug had a tremendous success in Mexico in the 1950s in increasing yields, more so than in India, as I'll show, but that wasn't deemed worthy of the Nobel Prize. It was not until India occurred that the Nobel Prize and a political myth was constructed. So let's look at some data. This is from FAO, which has a wonderful data base from this time period that Borlaug's talking about for wheat production in India. And I have three variables here. One is the area planted, which is in black. One is the yield, which is in blue, which is the amount per area, and the total harvest, which is the red. And there was indeed a 60% increase in wheat production in India over this period. So again, this reinforces this idea of political myth. But let's dig a little deeper. If you actually do the math and you ask, well, how much did the modern varieties contribute to this 60% increase? And I'm not going to go through all the math, but if you're interested, I have it, and it's in a draft paper. But the answer is that 10% of the increase was due to modern varieties. So it's not nothing, but it's not a tremendous amount. 37% of the increase was due to just more land being planted. But there's this, more than half of the increase was due to some other factor. What was that other factor? Well, one thing to recognize is that, as I just talked about with respect to innovation, it's not just technology, and as everyone knows here. This is Borlaug. He recognized that too. The other factors were sound governmental economic policy, seed, fertilizers, insecticides, weeds, and machinery, and credit. So there were social technologies, physical technologies, and governmental policies involved. But there's something still even more important, and this is typically overlooked in these discussions, and that's the weather. From 1965 to 1970, there was a enormous drought in India and then a recovery from the drought. So the top graph shows the production of wheat in India, and the bottom graph shows rainfall. And what you'll see is that in 1965 and 1966, India was in the midst of a 2-year drought. It was associated with an El Nino event, and it was the most severe drought in India since around 1905. So a lot of the increasing production that India saw was not due to Green Revolution technologies, it was due to the good fortune of the weather turning around. But that wasn't enough for a political mythology to be created. So there's 65, 66. Now there's a complicated set of arguments here that are all intertied together, and I'll try to tease out some of them. But politics is never far behind when we're talking about science, technology, and obviously myth. But the 4 issues that I identify as working together to help solidify this as a myth were the reemergence of neo-Malthusianism, U.S. foreign policy coupled with U.S. agricultural policy, and also the coincident political rise of the scientific community. So this is, again, that Time magazine cover from January 1960, and in Europe and the United States in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, there was great concern about a population crisis. My good friend and colleague Bjorn Ola Linner at Linköping University has written a wonderful book on Sweden's role in fostering the worry about a population explosion, but it really was a transatlantic phenomenon. And you see here, most of the faces are brown, and there was concern that the world was filling up with too many people over there. So the U.S. policies of the 50s and 60s helped to contribute to this. So the U.S. Cold War policy in India is absolutely essential in understanding how the Green Revolution became political myth. I'll go through a few of the factors. I'll assert some of them because I don't have time to go into the data. One was agricultural overproduction in the United States. For decades, and it continues to this day, the ability of the United States to produce food, and grains in particular, has far exceeded the ability of U.S. consumers to buy and eat them, even though people are getting bigger. So the government has to do something to try to keep farmers in business, because farmers have always had, like they do in Europe, a strong political presence. There was also concern about communist expansion in South Asia. Right, this is the time when the French were in Vietnam, the US was starting to emerge in Vietnam. The domino theory was another political myth. The domino theory that the countries would fall one by one to communism was the overarching zeitgeist of the time. The US started food aid to India in 1951, partly because the US had to do something with all that food. And so shipping food overseas became part of the US foreign policy. India was in a border dispute with China. India also played very closely along with the Soviet Union, which led to the US Congress being skeptical of India. And India was very critical of the United States. So this is part of the context. So in 1965, and this is from Nick Cullither's fantastic book, The Hungry World. So in 1965, Lyndon Johnson, who was president at the time, had a political problem. All right, so with this background. He wanted to continue the US food shipments to India. That was good politics. It was good domestic politics. But the US Congress was skeptical, in part due to India's criticisms of the US and its closeness with Russia. So Cullither notes, through the fall of 1965, Johnson developed the theme of a world food crisis brought on by runaway population growth. So in order to get around the congressional opposition, he was going to appeal to the sense of a global food crisis. Now, political leaders using science for political ends, we've never heard of that before. It's always existed, and here's an example from the 1960s. Now, this is data on drought deaths over the 20th century through 1970. 10-year average, and I'm not sure if you can see it, but there's two peaks there. One is in the 1920s, the other is in the 1940s. These might help to explain why there was concern about overpopulation. But one thing to note, in the 1960s, there was not significant drought deaths worldwide. This was not a time of tremendous hardship due to drought worldwide. So it was a difficult time for a politician to raise concern about overpopulation and a food crisis. So this was recognized. So this is from the London Times. Food ships streaming into famine-free India. So that's a problem. You have the US president arguing that there's a food crisis, and then these nosy reporters going in and finding there was none. Here's from that article. Journalists are coming in from abroad to report a historic calamity which is not taking place. Public collections are being made in Italy and Holland, for example, for famine relief here. So this was a problem. So what happened was that Indira Gandhi came to Washington to visit Lyndon Johnson, and they needed to get their stories straight. So they came, it was March 1966, and this is from so what's in red here are official quotes that you can find online from the US State Department. And the US explained to the Indian delegation that they needed to create a food crisis. It shouldn't be such as to frighten people in India, but on the other hand, the need must be seen to be real in the United States. It continues, the Indian delegation responded, the situation in the United States is that to get a response, the need must be somewhat overplayed. And the case should be presented as this being the year in which famine was averted. So remember, there was no famine. Yes, India had poverty, difficulties, but there was no out of the ordinary famine going on. This was a political creation. Now, scientists, always knowing which way the wind blows, decided that this was an opportunity. And so, March 1966, so very soon after Indira Gandhi visited, the US and India got their stories straight. The New York Times reported on the fears of atmospheric scientists who pointed to India as an example that we were losing the race to feed the world and raised the specter of population control. That's a direct quote. There was no famine, but it was being used as evidence that we're losing the race to feed the world. So the National Academy of Sciences in the United States organized a big meeting on world food supply. The meeting was organized and paid for by the Rockefeller Foundation. Now, if you're not aware, the Rockefeller Foundation is the same foundation that provided the original support for Norman Borlaug's work in Mexico for the Green Revolution work, and had a very strong interest in expanding this idea of the Green Revolution around the world. So the introductory remarks to this major conference. There is a growing consensus that the combination of annual deficits in world food supplies and onrushing population increase could spell disaster for the eventual attainment of world peace and prosperity. So there was an overt political orientation, and Roger Revelle, who you heard a little bit about yesterday from Naomi Oreskes, chaired this and focused on population control. We need coercive population control strategies in order to deal with this onrushing disaster. So here is the New York Times reporting on the National Academy of Sciences meeting. An assembly of leading food and agricultural scientists was told today, so think about how that's constructed. The food and agricultural specialists were told. They weren't the ones doing the telling. Was told today that unless the problem of feeding underdeveloped countries could be solved, the fate of all men will be the fate of India. There was no famine in India. The speaker was Dr. Roger Revelle, the head of the Center for Population Studies at Harvard University. So, does political myth matter? So I would say that it matters a great deal. So this is from Elder and Cobb. A symbolic consensus rests on the mutual attribution of significance to a symbol and on common affective sentiments toward it, not on agreement about its substantive meaning. A symbolic consensus is valuable and can sustain the political community only as long as the content attributed to politically significant symbols is not brought into question. People may be talking past one another when these symbols are used, but this is of little consequence as long as their referent is, for the most part, remote, abstract, ambiguously defined, or poorly understood. So if our job as technology assessors is to look into the content of politically significant symbols, to make technologies and their roles in broader society less remote, less abstract, less ambiguous, and better understood, then what we are doing is challenging political myths, inevitably. And I don't think we can get around that fact. So now we hear often, and I could take examples from all over the world, that we need a second green revolution. This is a good example of that sort of ambiguous statement, because we all have in our mind some picture of the first green revolution, what that actually meant. And I would say very few of us, and hopefully there will be more after I give this talk and write a paper on it, but very few of us have in our mind the idea of Lyndon Johnson and Indira Gandhi conspiring to create the image of a famine, and scientists then taking advantage of that to advance their own interests. That's not the mythology of the Green Revolution, but perhaps it should be. So when we hear about the need for a second green revolution, it's used to justify genetic biotechnology in crops, industrial agriculture, different trade patterns, and so on, which may or may not be necessary. These are things that we should openly discuss, but they are buried in the political mythology. So what if the Green Revolution never happened? This is a picture from a US movie called It's a Wonderful Life. It's shown around Christmas time with Jimmy Stewart. And it's a movie about a man who's so depressed and upset about his life that he's going to jump off a bridge and kill himself. And an angel comes down and says, well, here's what your life would look like if you didn't exist. And it goes around and shows all his family and his friends and how awful everything would be. And everything's happy at the end, which is why it's a nice Christmas movie. But I'm going to do the same thing. So let's look at some evidence, some studies that say, well, what if modern varieties of wheat and other crops never came into existence? What would the world have looked like? So Evanson and Rosegrant in 2003 asked this historical counterfactual. How would food prices, food production, food consumption, and international food trade have differed in the year 2000 if the developing countries of the world were constrained to have had no, they call it CGI, crop genetic improvement after 1965? No green revolution. While developed countries realized crop genetic improvement as they did historically, right? So India, Mexico, other countries, no green revolution occurred. What would the world look like? Here's what they say the world would look like. In the counterfactual, with no green revolution after 1965, the conclusion is that world grain prices would have risen instead of falling by 35% or more. This probably would not be considered a world food crisis. However, a more careful examination of the calculations would show that much of the shortfall in production in developing countries would be made up by increases in production in developed countries. So another way to look at this is the rich would get richer. But it also tells us that the famines that were predicted of the 1960s, they didn't fail to materialize because of the Green Revolution. They failed to materialize because they were never real in the first place. And there's a big difference there. So maybe there's a better political mythology for thinking about the Green Revolution. Maybe we should talk about a green evolution rather than green revolution. I have a longer version of this, but if you look at the improvement in crop production and crop technologies, the actual green revolution was after 1980. There was much more significant improvements after 1980 than before 1980. So the period we associate with the Green Revolution really quantitatively doesn't actually measure up. The world has been experiencing green evolution from 1750 to present. The Green Revolution was not a thing. It was not a moment in time, but a multi-century process. Incremental gains punctuated by occasional breakthroughs like the Haber-Bosch process, dwarf wheat, recombinant DNA. This story is also about the centrality of long-term applied R&D, what used to be called applied research, basic research, done by government, but R&D in broad social and political contexts, where we think about things like credit and government support and all sorts of mundane technologies like fertilizer and so on. All right, so let me start winding this up and then perhaps we can have a discussion. So what are we doing when we're doing technology assessment? Hopefully now this is more clear. We are constructing, reinforcing, and defending political myth. It is unavoidable. That is what we do. So let me just say a few things about what our proper roles and responsibilities are as technology assessors. So the first thing I want to say is I would argue that technology assessors, however you wish to define them, have a pretty special role in society. Not everyone is engaged with critiquing or creating political myth. Therefore, we have some role in a democracy that could be used for good or bad purposes. Now, I would argue that technology assessment should be more than this, which often, if you see the discourse on GMOs or climate change or e-cigarettes or pick your topic, on the one side there's an apocalypse, a horrible road to go down, characterized by the anti-science evil guys. We heard about some of them yesterday. On the other fork in the road, there's redemption, follow the voice of science and rationality. The world is obviously much more complicated than this, but a lot of the debates, as they become politicized, fall into these apocalypse versus redemption narratives. The Green Revolution story of the 1960s is certainly like this. I will just say briefly, some of you are familiar with my book, The Honest Broker, that one role we ought to be playing as technology assessors, not everyone, but some of us should, is the honest broker of policy alternatives. The emphasis there isn't on the honest part, it's on the broker part. We ought to be able to critique political myths and offer up different versions to help people decide how they want to see the world. I would argue that a critique of the Green Revolution is absolutely essential if we're going to make good decisions about agricultural biotechnology, GM technologies going forward. Are they necessary? Maybe, maybe not. Are they desirable? Maybe, maybe not. But one thing is clear: if we carry around a misleading narrative, worldview, political myth about the first Green Revolution, then we're probably going to mislead ourselves in our discussions about the second Green Revolution. So opening up that space to debate, discussion, reframing is one of the things we ought to be doing as technology assessors, and I would characterize that as consistent with the idea of honest brokering of policy alternatives. Thank you for your attention, and I'd love to have a conversation with you. And you can find me online, very easy, and I'll be here for the next 2 days, and I'd love to have your feedback because this will be a paper or two soon. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The floor is now open for discussion, but I would like to ask the first question. Interestingly, this talk, it seems like you're, in your first book, or in The Honest Broker, you're asking for more science in policy or more policy in science. Now it seems you're really entering the value debate much more. You tell us make issues less remote because then we're much less talking across purpose, and debunk myths, talk about values and underlying ethics, talk about symbols. And the last thing you say, construct new myths. And this is new. In The Honest Broker, you said we shouldn't do this. We shouldn't enter this game of myths. But how do you see, how can you, what would you tell us, as most of us in this audience are professional brokers, how to construct new myths? How far can we go in that? And how much power do we have to reframe and claim the debate? Or how do we stay honest while we reframe? Because it could go the other way.
Yeah, well, that's, it's a great question. And there is this idea that's out there that we can cleanly separate out facts and values. I'm not one of the people that believes that we can do that. The values are always present. Absolutely always present, even when we don't see them. And so one of the things I argued in The Honest Broker was that we have to be very explicit about values. And so the argument that I'm making today is, and you may choose to believe this or not, but we don't have a choice when it comes to political myth. Once you take that step into saying, I'm going to do technology assessment, you are in the business of shaping, creating, making political myth. So the first response is, we don't have a choice. Mm-hmm. So the second then is to think very carefully about, well, what then does that entail when we're doing that? Sometimes, some of us are in the business of reinforcing certain political myths because of our values, our preferences. We're advocating that the world should be seen in this way. Many of you are familiar with the trouble that Ann Glover got into over GM Technologies when she was, in effect, trying to advance a particular political myth that was not widely shared. One thing we can do is decide, are we advocates for framing the world in a particular way, or are we going to try to help politicians, parliaments, the general public, to come up with better, and by better I mean more effective, framings. And that's a choice we each have to face, but we do have to face it.
And we have to be clear about also when we reframe why
Right.
we do it that way.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Attila Havas, Institute of Economics, Hungarian Academy of Sciences. 2 quick questions. Is there a difference between narratives and myths? And is there a difference between being a facilitator or a manipulator of a process of evaluating technological opportunities?
Yeah, so the first question, I don't know. Maybe. It depends on what you mean by those terms, narrative and myth. But the second question is about being a manipulator or a facilitator. And I do think that people who are in the business of constructing political myth can be manipulative. We do have the ability. Lyndon Johnson, Indira Gandhi, clearly were manipulating the political arena for certain purposes. It was not in their interest to be facilitators. They could have said, well, there's not really a famine, but we need to get rid of all this food to make the farmers happy in the Soviet Union and blah, blah, blah. That's probably not their role. But for some of us, that should be our role. And this is where technology assessors sometimes get into trouble. A few weeks ago when I was in Brussels, I had lunch with a colleague and was talking about this talk, and I said, imagine European supermarkets full of GM technologies in the food. And my colleague said, I can't imagine that. And part of our job is to imagine things that are unimaginable. Imagine the United States with electric vehicles or nuclear power from coast to coast. It's hard to do, but that's our job. So I think part of being a facilitator is to bringing uncomfortable, maybe unwelcome thinking about technologies in broader society to the attention of the public. Now, if you have a particular view, if you are against nuclear power, the technology assessor who says, imagine the United States with 2,000 nuclear power plants is not a welcome participant in the debate. I think there should be room for both. So the answer is yes, there's manipulators. That goes along with politics, but we also need some facilitators, and they should coexist.
René van Schomburg. My question is also on the concept and the consequence of it. So your example of a political myth with this particular intertwinement of elements of truth and stories which are not falsifiable. It is exactly also got me off thinking to advance the concept of responsible innovation, because we have in Europe, not much different as in the US, this idea that science and technology policy can only be justified in macroeconomic terms. For instance, just as an example, we have justified our 80 billion investment in the framework program by reference to the fact that it will produce 3.6 million jobs. Now, this is very interesting. It's not 3.5 or 3.7, it's 3.6, although the technological means which are suggested to produce these jobs are completely unknown. So there is this is part of the story. The other thing in Europe is, of course, as just another example, to make the point clear, where I depart actually from your diagnosis. We are into these austerity measures. If you read the work of Krugman in the New York Times, I mean, Europe is completely mad. They are followed by fantasy economists. But then the question, of course, comes, because this is also your story and your analysis of these political myths, you still assume that you can identify the truth. You tell us, no, it was not a green revolution, it was just a matter of the weather. You all got it wrong, and I know what is right. The problem is, of course, that we apparently are not able to distinguish between the identifiable truth by individuals and doing this collectively the same way. It seems that you then go down the line from, like Ann Glover, who is frustrated, they don't listen to the truth, GMOs is safe, it's proven 100,000 times, and the Europeans don't listen. So what's the matter with them? The same as with the fantasy economists. Now, I think the problem is a little bit more complicated, because the analysis of why we produce these myths is actually how our institutions are guided by knowledge to develop these policies. And I think our institutions are constructed in a way that we use bodies of knowledge, which, of course, and this is the translation of individual identifiable truth to collectively identify bodies of knowledge, is the shift from evaluation to prospective analysis. And that's not different with TA. We make evaluations of situations of the past, we turn them into prospective analysis, which obviously for too complex situations, which leads, of course, then to these myths. So the question is, and that's actually for you to answer, why we don't listen to the truth. cannot be answered by saying, well, we have to do like Anne Glover, become a scientific missions, put a scientist behind every decision maker. This is, of course, ridiculous and also silly. But the alternative is, of course, that our institutions have to adjust themselves in the way we evaluate knowledge for guidance and how we use them for prospective analysis. And that's actually missing. And as long as we cannot do that, we will not advance. And this is also where I depart from your analysis, that I go from, let's say, from evaluation to advancement. Oh, sorry, I will stop.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, let me just
Quick
quickly
comment.
say, with respect to the story I told today, I only partially mean what I'm going to say, but forget about the truth, right? So the story that I'm telling you about the Green Revolution may or may not be any more or less true than the broad myth that has sustained for a long time. What happens with political myth is they sustain as long as they work in a pragmatic, practical sense. So to take your first example, if you say, well, you put money into a framework program, or in the United States, put it into the National Science Foundation, and we'll get jobs. If the economy is doing well and jobs appear, that causal relationship, is it true or not? Who cares, right? But if you put money in and politicians say, well, I don't see any evidence, our economy's not working, we have unemployment, then the myth will begin to break down. This is exactly the story of basic research, that you saw the increase and then the decrease. The decrease coincided with the end of the Cold War, right? The overriding justification for why basic research was needed no longer worked. And scientists have been trying fundamental research, innovative research, frontier research. They've been trying to come up with a new myth. The answer is always more science, of course, but they need a new myth to justify it. So when the myth breaks down, not in a truth sense, but in a practical sense, that's when we need new. Now, there's of course some relationship between how things work in the real world and our political myths, but it's not always as close as you might think. So what I am trying to argue to you is that there is a better mythology of the Green Revolution if the goal is to use that as a practical model for thinking about feeding the world and innovation policy going forward. So and I take your discussion. It's not about truth, at least not in the main.
Gilbert File, sorry. I have been operating in the Brussels science policy environment for more than 30 years. So I have a sound, I would say, pragmatic, realistic, and slightly critical view on the whole situation. I would argue that political myth is inherent in every democratic system. Beyond that, it is useful. And we who try to provide scientific related advice, we are running after the events. We are never dictating it. Check the situation. The European Union, the vice political leaders identified the political objective to become the world's most competitive knowledge society. This is a rubbish. Rubbish because there is no way to measure. The second, every society who created the progress for the humanity since the Stone Age and even before have been knowledge-based society. It has never happened, with a few exceptions, I will come into this, that the knowledge was...
I would like to ask you to keep it a bit short, so we
my
have,
point
yeah,
is,
we are at the end of
my point is that
the
I
hour.
agree with you. However, we have a fundamental problem in the whole democratic system. It is always the political leaders who dictate the agenda, and they have short-term objective to be re-elected. We run after, and we provide arguments which justify the previous re-election, never the next one. Thank you. But we could continue on this.
a quick response.
we can go to...
Next question, Lars or someone else?
Well, in a way it follows up on this. I mean, if we, retrospectively, you can analyze these things, but when myths are in the making, it's a very different situation. If you go for the stakeholder model, which I think modern TA does, then basically you can take two positions when myths are in the making. You can oppose the making of myths. You can just say when they're coming up, let's go against them because they're probably manipulatory in some way. I think we have a problem then because of what Gilbert says. And that would be a very conservative stance. The other thing you could do is to try to make the better myth, which is, I think, that fits well with taking the stakeholder model in a way. Going together with stakeholders and see which myth is it we want. Could that be a role for TA, or is that a little too much taking the leadership role?
Yeah, well, I don't think there's anything wrong with leadership. In a lot of these issues, we need leadership. And I will say, the two cases I presented them for a reason because they are retrospective. It is very difficult to engage in myth-making or myth critique in the context of people's already solidified. The Green Revolution is fairly safe. Basic research is fairly safe. But if I were to come up here and instead use the example of climate change or GM technologies, it would be a little more difficult because we all have our existing frames for that. So how we do technology assessment in the context of technologies that are emerging, or I think it's a great question. I don't have a very good answer for that. I've been involved with colleagues in the UK and in Europe on trying to reframe aspects of the climate debate for a long time. Can't say I've learned a lot of good lessons other than to stay away from the climate debate. So yes, but this is where formalized mechanisms of citizen engagement, but also expert engagement, I think are really necessary to provide a safe space for that to occur. And I think there are some notable successes, mainly in Europe, some in the US, of where these questions have been fruitfully addressed. But I don't think our track record overall is that good.